1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 40 through 50. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, that is, in his shepherd's pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Then the Philistine came and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he was contemptuous of him, for he was only a youth and reddish with a handsome appearance. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you would come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Then the Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild animals." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a saber. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you and remove your head from you. Then I will give the dead bodies of the army to the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that this entire assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will save you, and he will hand you over to us." Then it happened, when the Philistine came closer to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put in his hand into his bag and took out from the stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. And the stone penetrated his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. He struck the Philistine and killed him, and there was no sword in David's hand. David and Goliath might strike some of you as a strange choice for a Bible passage on the day honoring fathers, because there's not a lot of fathers in the story. In 1 Samuel 17, David is still just a boy, too young to follow his older brothers to war. As far as we know, Goliath was never a father. He was married to the art of war. Saul was a father, but the only thing we have mentioned in this passage about him being a father is the fact that he offered his daughter's hand in marriage to anyone who would beat up Goliath, which doesn't necessarily make him a really good example. And then there's Jesse. Jesse instructs David to take some bread and cheese to his 3 brothers who had followed King Saul into war. The cheese was especially meant for their commanding officers. Perhaps Jesse was hoping that 10 slices of cheese, don't you love the specificity of the Bible? 10 slices of cheese, no more, no less. That 10 slices of cheese would save his 3 eldest sons from the front lines, or perhaps that was just what it cost David to gain access to his brothers. Whatever the case, David did as his father instructed him and found his brothers in battle formation in the valley of Elah. The 2 armies had been at stalemate in this valley for 40 days. The problem was that the 2 armies were camped at either side of this valley, and whatever army rushed into the valley first in order to attack, that would give the other army the advantage, being on the higher ground. And so no army was willing to rush into the valley to attack first. So basically what they do is they'd come down every day, form battle lines, and then scream insults at each other. The Philistines, they had a solution to this problem, and that solution was for each side to pick a champion or someone to fight for them. The Philistine champion was Goliath. Although there's some argument about the exact details, in a time when the average height of a man was about 160 centimeters, Goliath stood at about 250 to 275 centimeters. His armor alone weighed 58 kilograms, and the iron point of his massive spear weighed almost 7 kilograms. In other words, Goliath was not just big, Goliath was strong. And more than that, he had dedicated his life to the art of war. The biggest Israelite, in contrast, was King Saul. According to 1 Samuel 9:2, Saul was head and shoulders above every other Israelite. Perhaps he was 200 centimeters tall. Quite a bit shorter than Goliath. As king, Saul bore the responsibility of fighting Goliath, but had no interest in losing his life. So the stalemate continued. Every day, the armies would come up, they'd insult each other, and then they'd go back to bed. That is, until David showed up. As I think about it, this is where I really start to see fathers in this passage. You see, most dads kind of understand what it means to be on the sidelines of a battle they cannot win, while mothers are busy growing babies and fathers are, like David, relegated to supply duty, hoping to find ice cream or, in my case, falafel in the middle of the night. Then at the actual birth itself, fathers take on a sort of support role while mothers, doctors, and nurses do all the work of bringing the child into the world. You see, even as our children grow, it seems like we are always facing one Goliath or another, childhood bullies who have to, and our kids have to stand up for themselves, or the pain of a broken bone that we wish we could take away, but we can't. And then worse than those physical pains, there's the life traumas that our kids have to go through. A broken heart, the betrayal of a good friend, dealing with failure. If childhood teaches us anything, it is that the world is full of battles that we cannot fight, and whatever equipment we possess to help our children seems willfully inadequate. But God doesn't leave us helpless. God had prepared David for his battle with Goliath. In verse 36, David explains to Saul, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." God has already allowed David to face enemies who were bigger and stronger than him. Goliath? He's just simply the next step. It's tempting to view our difficulties as hurdles to overcome and forget. But what if we started to think of them as opportunities for God to bless us and give us success? I think about the story of Catherine Booth, the co-founder of the Salvation Army. She had scoliosis, and as a result, she spent much of her adolescence bedridden. In her 61 years, Booth never experienced robust health, and once remarked, "I can scarcely remember a day in my life which has been free from pain." However, Booth used her long periods of incapacitation to read and study her Bible, to write articles, and develop strong opinions on matters of temperance and religion. This perfectly prepared Catherine for her role as the mother of the Salvation Army. She even became mother to 8 children. She was the driving force behind the Salvation Army's positions on topics like social justice, women in ministry, and abstaining from alcohol. Moreover, Catherine and William raised children who were early leaders in the movement they started, proving themselves to be able teachers and administrators. The life of Catherine Booth teaches us how hardship can put us right in the place God needs us to bless us and give us success. We've been studying a little bit in these past few weeks the book of 1 Peter. And 1 Peter 5:10 says, "After you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, and establish you." Whatever you're facing right now, whatever suffering you're going through, whatever battle that you have, it's important to understand that perhaps that battle, perhaps that suffering, perhaps that trial is only serving to, as the words of Peter says, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. You see, God is already planning for your victory. Moreover, David realized that the real conflict here was not between he and Goliath, but between the living God and the Philistine scoffer. 4 times, David reiterates that it is much more than a physical battle, but a spiritual battle. Verse 26, he says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he has dared to defy the armies of the living God?" Verse 36, "Since he has defied the armies of the living God." Verse 46, "This day the Lord will hand you over to me." And verse 47, "For the battle is the Lord's." You see, sometimes we fall into the trap of forgetting where the real battle is. We end up spending incredible amounts of time and effort fighting for things that simply don't matter. I remember in 1982, Paul Tsongas ran for president of the United States. Despite losing the Democratic nomination, he was still a very popular and prominent national figure when a year later he was diagnosed with cancer. This diagnosis led Tsongas to completely reevaluate his life. He later wrote, "I used to walk my kids to school and think about nothing but re-election. Now I walk my kids to school and I think about my kids." Somebody wrote me a letter and said, nobody on his deathbed ever said, "I'd wish I'd spent more time in my business." It is shamefully easy for you and I to believe that the real goal of life is success or wealth or influence. However, the real goal of life is eternity with Christ. If we place who we are and what we do within that context, we find that our priorities begin to align with God's priorities. We start to understand that Jesus meant when he said, "Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven." And this helps explain David's fearlessness as well. David never thinks of this as a battle between a boy and a man. David rightfully places this battle between God and Goliath. And in that scenario, Goliath loses every time. When we look at the battles we face in our daily lives, we are challenged to place them within God's larger plan. Like sure, we all need some money in order to survive. We all need a little bit of success in our lives. We certainly want to live good lives. But are those lives pointing us toward heaven? When we begin to rightly perceive ourselves, our relationships, even our struggles in an eternal context, our eyes start to open. We begin to see the real battle belongs to God. Listen to the words of Moses to the Israelites. When you go out to battle against your enemies, now think about those battles you're facing today. When you go out to battle against your enemies, and you see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, when you go out and face your battles, and you see things that are bigger than you, things that you simply do not know if you can overcome, Moses says, "Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, who brought us out of sin, who brought us out of slavery, that God is with you." Listen to this, Moses says, you are approaching the battle against your enemies today, but do not be faint-hearted. Do not be afraid. Do not panic or be terrified, for the Lord your God is the one who is going with you. He will fight against your enemies. When God is fighting for us, God wins every time. Even when it says in verse 50, and this is one of my favorite verses in this passage in 1 Samuel, even when it says that there is no sword in our hand. And as a result of his victory over Goliath, David increases his influence. At the beginning of our story, David's just a kid. In fact, his older brother, Eliab, I cannot see that word for the life of me, dresses him down in verse 28 for his insolence. But by the end of this story, David is a leader of men whose victory over Goliath impacts both the Philistines and the Israelite armies. You see, David's defeat of one man, Goliath, means a great victory for an entire army. I think it's easy for us to underestimate the impact that we can have, especially if we view our lives and our actions without God's empowerment and influence. For instance, you might have heard of the parable of the leaky bucket. The story goes that there were two buckets. One was perfect and the other was leaky. And every day a man would go down to the river and he would fill his two buckets and hoist them over his shoulder and walk back with the water he needed for the day. Now, of course, the leaky bucket would drip, 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 drip the whole way back. And by the time he got back, it'd be like halfway full, if even that. Well, the full bucket every day came back completely full. Finally, the leaky bucket had had enough. He looked at the man one day and he said, Why don't you just get rid of me? I'm always disappointing you. Every day you go down to the river and you get a full bucket, but by the time we get back to the house, I'm half full. Don't you think it's time just to get something new, to get something like the other bucket, the perfect bucket that always comes back full? Well, the man shook his head and said, my bucket, you don't understand. Today when we go to the river and I fill you up, I want you to look as we come back. So the man took the bucket down to the river and filled up the buckets. And as he walked back, and the leaky bucket again started dripping, drip, 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 he saw this time that each of those droplets of water fell along gorgeous wildflowers that had popped up on his side of the path. You see, the leaky bucket was leaking, but was also watering the man's beautiful garden. The man looked down at his precious leaky bucket and said, you see, some days I wouldn't have the strength to get both buckets back to the house if it weren't for the beautiful flowers you have given me, which encourage me every day along my route. Sometimes we have to take our failures, what we feel like are our flaws, we have to place them in God's hand. David, he refused to see himself as a powerless boy, choosing instead to view himself as a tool for God to use. As a result, David became a symbolic leader of Israel long before he wore a crown on his head. Our time on earth, the time before we receive our crown of glory, should be a time of glorifying and honoring our Heavenly Father. David is called in the Bible a man after God's own heart because from a very young age, he was able to see things from God's perspective. He understood the challenges and the struggles that he faced as a shepherd, prepared him to lead people instead of sheep. He realized the importance of leaving his battles in God's hands and allowing God to fight on his behalf. And as a result, David was able to lead his people to great victory and to increase his influence. My friends, no matter where you are in life today, many of us might feel like we're fighting battles with giants. We're fighting battles with forces and people more powerful than we could ever be. My encouragement to you today is that the Lord always wins his battle. If it's a battle between our enemies and God, God's going to win every time. But he won't win with swords or spears. He uses people completely dedicated to him and whatever meager resources they might have. So whatever you're facing today, place yourself at the very center of God's will and allow God to fight on your behalf. Allow God to give you the victory.